Now, we'd like to proceed to the keynote presentations of this symposium. And direct from the FAO headquarters in Rome, Italy, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Joseph SCHMIDHUBER, Deputy Director in the Market and Trade Division of the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, to talk on the impacts of COVID-19 on the resilience of the global food system.
Good morning from Europe. Good afternoon to Japan. I hope that I can be heard and my screen can be seen. Okay, if I assume this is the case, and let me start with the presentation now. Good morning from Europe and good afternoon to Japan. I just would like to get a feedback from the organizers whether my screen can be seen and my voice can be heard. Okay, let me start with the presentation. Thanks for the invitation and special thanks to the president of JIRCAS, Mr. Masaiba Naga, and of course also to Vice President of JIRCA, Mr. Osamu Koyama, my former FAO colleague and dear friend. This is a presentation that looks into the various channels of transmission from an economic perspective, focusing on trade. I tried to organize my talk around 4 major topics. So I will look into the channels of transmission of COVID-19 on agriculture and in particular on the agricultural economy. We'll then move on to focusing on trade as a special channel of transmission, look into food input bills, and eventually provide a summary. So what are the channels of transmission? Well, as you know, in agriculture and agricultural markets, we typically distinguish between demand and supply. So food and agricultural demand and food and agricultural supply. Typically, supply depends on factor intensities. That's what the economic jargon would say. So what do we mean by factor intensities? We have essentially 3 major factors of production. One is capital, the other one is land, and the third is labor. And within capital, we distinguish between intermediate inputs such as seed and feed and fertilizer and pesticides and diesel, etc. And of course, fixed capital such as machinery and structures. All of these are, of course, affected by COVID, and they in turn affect food supply. So very simply put, for instance, the intermediate factors of production like fertilizer or pesticides, they can vary with price. In fact, they have been varying in price and affect food supply. And very important, more for developing countries, is actually labor as an input into production. And there we actually have seen considerable disruptions. We saw disruptions in fruits and vegetables production. We also saw disruptions, for instance, in the abattoir, in the meat processing industry in developed countries, but actually not only in developed countries, also in Latin America, in a number of other countries, including in China, and all of this had impacts on food supply. There are many other factors, and I will delve into some of them in greater detail. So there is certainly exchange rates, which COVID affected in an enormous way. We saw tremendous changes in exchange rate swings. We saw changes in energy market up to a level where oil prices became negative to the tune of -$30 a barrel, impacts on credit markets, impacts on remittances, impacts on tourism. All these things affect both supply and demand. And of course, the impacts completely depend on how much consumers spend on food of the total budget and how elastic their reaction is. All of this, of course, is also affecting trade, and trade is again affecting both supply and demand. And this will be the second part of my presentation, where I look into trade impacts more generally. Before so doing, let me first look into the import dependency rate. So which countries are actually heavily dependent on food imports? And here we see already a cluster of countries that we should bear in mind. So these are a lot of little islands, and I could have included also actually the Caribbean, but it's certainly South Pacific. It's the South Asian Ocean, so it's the Maldives, Seychelles, etc. And of course, it is the Arabian Peninsula with the Gulf Cooperation states, but also, of course, in fact, the entire Near East North African region and parts of Sub-Saharan Africa. If you think of Angola, Namibia, or Botswana, they are all heavily dependent on food imports. So clearly, they have a priori a high exposure to a pandemic like COVID. Some other countries are actually not dependent on food imports, but perhaps also dependent on food imports, but they are dependent on exports of certain commodities. And here I focused on energy. Actually, the same holds for metals and minerals, etc. But let's focus on energy here. Again, one of the regions that we've already looked into before is the Near East North African region with the GCCs, the Gulf Cooperation states, particularly dependent on exports of energy, hydrocarbons, but also Russia, Central Asia, and of course, countries like Colombia, Venezuela. So in fact, these Near East North African countries are in a particular way exposed as they are, as we say, exporting hydrocarbons and they're importing carbohydrates. Another group of countries that is particularly exposed are those that depend on tourism. And as we've seen already, this is very similar to the countries that are actually dependent on food imports. So here we have, again, the Maldives, Seychelles, the Caribbean countries, and the South Pacific islands. So these are all what is typically called ZIDs, so small island developing states. And they essentially are affected through at least three channels of transmission. One is tourism, the other one is remittances, and the third one is food import dependency. And these countries certainly were hardest hit by the COVID pandemic, not least because a lot of their food imports also come through the bellies of passenger planes, and there was essentially no passenger flights anymore. Their food supplies were disrupted. I alluded already to another channel of transmission, that's the remittances. So remittances can account for a considerable share of GDP, in some countries up to 30% and more of GDP, and the particular recipients are in South Asia. So that's Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and even big countries like Bangladesh, at least populous countries like Bangladesh, get 10% of their total GDP from remittances. And where do they come from? Well, they come actually from countries that are heavily affected by COVID. So that's the Gulf Cooperation states. They're working there as guest workers. And as they are losing their jobs or didn't receive as much salary as before, of course, also the remittances dried up. And that was an important channel of transmission that certainly wasn't income and hence actually access to food. So we tried to summarize all these factors of transmission, these channels of transmission, and that's just a brief overview. So the key take-home message here is that developed countries are much less affected overall, and if they are affected, they're typically affected because of a high exposure in terms of their supply side, and there it can be due to labor shortages, as we've seen it actually in the fruits and vegetables sector, or also in the meat processing sector. Developing countries, by contrast, and that's you see on the right side, they have a high exposure on the demand side. So they are typically exposed because they don't have enough income. That can come from lower tourism, it can come from lower remittances, or it can come from lower economic activity more general, so high unemployment and GDP contractions. And of course, they are much more exposed because they spend a lot more money on expenses for food and agriculture, for food purchases, and they are more elastic in reacting to this, or more responsive in reacting to this. And that, of course, can mean that they essentially have to eat less or shift to a less nutritious diet. And that's certainly happening in much of Sub-Saharan Africa. So let me quickly focus on trade as a key channel of transmission, because the situation is also rather different, and it's rather surprising in many ways. And these are complicated charts, but I'm happy to explain them in a moment. So in fact, in both cases, and I start with the most aggregate way of displaying trade, that's total merchandise trade, so everything that can be traded except for services. And on the left side, you essentially see trade in nominal values. And on the right side, you see volumes, so that's in constant US dollars. This is probably the most frequently used way of depicting trade. So these salmon-colored bars is something that you see in every major publication. Typically, they're only available on an annual frequency. Here, it's actually on a monthly frequency to see the impacts of COVID. You also see two other lines, a blue line and a green line. Both are changes on a month-on-month basis, but the blue line is looking back 12 months and the green line is looking back 1 month. And that essentially allows to capture the oscillation of trade very nicely. So what do we see here? In fact, if we focus on the final bit here, we see the impacts of COVID. And no doubt there was an impact on total merchandise trade as far as COVID is concerned. But if we compare this even with a small trade recession between 2014 and 2016, it's colloquially put, nothing to write home about. So it was a very mild trade recession. And it was a lot milder and a lot shorter than during what's called the Great Recession, so during the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. So it really looks as though that was, so far at least, a very mild trade recession. If we look at this in terms of volume, which is a surrogate for looking into quantities, then the trade recession is even milder. And we can even say that we are very close to pre-crisis levels already, at least assuming that there will be no second wave for the time being. So without zeroing on the WTO, they do a splendid job in monitoring trade, but this is their prediction at the beginning of the pandemic in April 2020. And they essentially saw as the most optimistic scenario a decline that was still stronger than during the Great Recession, and the pessimistic scenario, a real contraction in trade. None of this has come through, and that's very positive. It's very positive for the world economy. It's very positive also for agriculture. And as we see for agriculture, the impacts are practically not discernible, particularly when we look into the volumes here. So this COVID reduction is practically, or COVID recession is practically invisible. And it's the same for the nominal values. In fact, we see a little bit of a drop in terms of volumes, which essentially means that prices for agriculture have gone up a little, at least, reducing the volumes, but this is not visible on the value base. And actually, in a paper that I wrote at the beginning of the pandemic, this was well predicted. And the key factors are, of course, well known. They include, for instance, the fact that agricultural demand is relatively inelastic. That means that countries have to import, and this, the last thing they will stop importing is actually food and agricultural goods. Then a lot of the agricultural trade is not trade that is heavily dependent on supply chains. Yet a lot of trade is in bulk, not even in containers, so it doesn't require a lot of human interaction. And so overall, there was also no adverse policy reaction to the pandemic, so no export restrictions. And all of these factors led to a situation where agricultural trade was hardly affected. There were some changes, as we will see in a moment, but they had nothing to do, or very little to do, with COVID. So here are a few charts, just in case you cannot see the chart well on the smaller scale. So again, agriculture on the left side, hardly any impact. There was a reduction on total merchandise trade, but a very mild one. Good. If we now focus on agriculture again and look at individual countries, we see there are two countries that were really affected. That's China and that's the US. But the increase in imports in China had little to do with COVID. It was mainly due to the fact that China had African swine fever since August 2018, and so it has reduced its imports in the reference period of June to July 2019, and that actually now led to an explosion in imports, particularly of pork, but also of other meats and as well as soybeans. At the same time, there is a contraction in exports for the US, which was in part also due to the fact that there was a China-US trade conflict. In percentage terms, there is essentially this almost disappears. We essentially see a starry night, so a almost perfect distribution over the various exporters and importers. So let me finish with the food import bills. This is actually something that will be published this week in Food Outlook, and much of the analysis was already done. So overall, the impacts on the food import bill are very mild, practically within the measurement areas. So in comparison to the first half of 2019, it's just an increase of $500 million, which is a rounding error. It's not really visible. And compared with the second half of 2019, so the direct increase, it's a mild reduction, but it's again something very, very small, and it's not necessarily a volume reduction rather than a value reduction. So the quantities are the same. However, there are important shifts within the input bill. And so what we see is a strong decline in the high value goods. So there is a reaction, there is an import elasticity, there is a responsiveness, and that responsiveness affects mainly the high value goods. That's actually not something that should surprise us given the strong contractions in GDP. So we do see contractions in fish imports, but also in the beverage sector. So that's including the alcoholic beverages like wine and beer, etc. So they are strongly affected and very noticeably so. At the same time, there is a shift towards oilseeds and oils, etc. Very strongly so, and a little bit also towards cereals. So if one were to put this together in a colloquial way, we're shifting away from the high value goods to the staple foods. At the same time, there is actually an increase in fruits and vegetables consumption and imports, and that's mainly due to the fact that a lot of people placed more emphasis on healthy diets, and that was actually something that was very welcome with the pandemic, and so fruits and vegetables benefited from this. It also suggests that the value chains were not as disrupted as we first thought. In fact, what we notice is that a lot of the African countries, say Egypt or Kenya, took advantage of the disrupted value chains in Europe, for instance, for citrus, and they quickly exported off-season a lot more fruits and vegetables to Europe and actually benefited from the COVID pandemic. If we look at the same thing in terms of volume, so not something that is no longer affected by the price changes, then it becomes even clearer that there is a very strong shift away from fruits and fish and beverages towards things like oilseeds. So clearly, the high value goods are down, not necessarily the quality of the diet, but the high value goods are down and the lower value goods are up in terms of consumption. Now, not everything that glitters is gold, and I think that's quite important to emphasize here. A lot of countries, and I mentioned this at the beginning, actually see themselves in a very difficult situation in still meeting their food supplies. In particular, these are countries that have high food import dependency rates, like North African countries, but also Middle East countries, but also countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, like Angola. They have relatively depleted foreign exchange reserves. They saw strong reductions in their real exchange rates, not all of them, but many did. And that actually led to a situation where their credit rating declined. And as their credit rating declined, it was more difficult for them to get access to loans. And as they had more difficulty in getting access to loans, it was more difficult to purchase the food imports. So there are quite a number of countries that are in a rather precarious situation, and particularly worrisome is a situation where countries were already dependent on food imports and they now find themselves with fewer export earnings, a falling exchange rate and falling credit ratings. So with this, let me sum it up. Just a few points. So overall, we noticed that global agricultural trade remained remarkably resilient to the shocks of COVID-19. There are no doubt the country-specific woes amid the global resilience. The small island development states are particularly hard hit, and the same holds for essentially the exporters of oil and gas and the exporters of minerals. The food import bills, and that's very positive, remained largely unchanged. We do see, however, more imports of cheaper calories and less protein, and that's certainly not something that is welcome, but at the same time, there's more trade in fruits and vegetables, which is no doubt good. There is a certain class of countries that are in difficulties through a combination of different factors. So they saw a lower exchange rate, they saw lower export revenues, lower overall economic growth. And when these are countries where we see already food insecurity problems, and that's certainly the case in African countries, that can lead to a further deterioration of food security, and that's certainly happening. Now, since yesterday, we know that there will be a very successful vaccine. The question is, when will it be available, and can it actually avoid and avert a second wave of COVID? If that's the case, then I think we have seen the biggest challenges. If that's not the case, we could see actually a deterioration of the situation as at least as strong as it was during the first wave. With this, I thank you for your attention. I hope that the presentation got through. Thanks again for the invitation. Thank you.